Well, my name is Nate Long. I was born on the continent of Europe sometime after the launch of DARPANET and sometimes before the innovation of Tim Berners-Lee, which is a big bracket in case you're wondering. How's that for telling you about me but not giving away essential details? I've walked through the valley of the shadow of the internet for over 20 years. We won't count how many over 20. But let me tell you a little bit more about myself. When I was younger, my family and I lived in East St. Louis, Illinois, which is on the wrong side of the river from St. Louis, Missouri. And at least at the time, it was a very dangerous place to live. Let me give you a little example of what that could mean. I have a buddy who grew up in the same region and graduated high school there. While he was in high school, they used to drive across the river over to East St. Louis in order to buy beer because nobody carded anyone in East St. Louis. And on one occasion, he and his buddies got stopped at a stop sign by a policeman who looked inside the car, looked at each of them, clearly understood what was going on and said, "Don't stop at another stoplight before you get out of town." So that's the kind of place that we lived in. So in the wee hours of the morning, one night, as my mom and dad were in bed and they heard footsteps out in the hallway, they were understandably concerned. As my dad tells the story, he was frantically trying to remember, had he brought the baseball bat into the bedroom that night or not? My mom talks about pulling the covers up as far as she could. The footsteps came down the hallway towards their bedroom, and then the door began to creak open, and the intruder actually entered their bedroom. Didn't just enter, but walked all the way up to the side of their bed, climbed up and stood on the mattress, towering over them, and said, "I want in the middle." And it was me at age 3. What on earth does that have to do with cybersecurity? Well, to make the connection, let me tell you another story. My then 14-year-old daughter sent me a text, and I got another one at almost the same time. Hers said, "Dad, there's a creepy bald guy with tattoos outside my window." I replied back, "Don't worry, it's just James Mountford. He's a teddy bear." No, I said, "Hey, it's the roofing contractor. He's supposed to be there." But the other text came from Aunt Millie, who lives across the street, also informing me that there was someone roaming around our home. What makes a good or a bad, a safe or a dangerous neighborhood is its proximity. And the point that I want to draw home to all of our new employee orientations, for example, is that on the internet, you are equidistant from every good and every bad neighborhood. There's only milliseconds separating you, no matter where you are, from the would-be hacker in Romania or Bulgaria or whatever those countries are that you block in your firewall policy. And in your home, there are on average 12 to 14 different IP-connected devices, which are all the equivalent of an unlocked door or window. Imagine going to bed in a bad neighborhood having not checked whether the doors were locked or whether Aunt Millie was across the street watching to make sure that your family was safe. These are the reasons why internet security is important. And so now I've just recruited your amygdala to join me in helping you to remember the things we're going to talk about. We've entered the motivation arena of the process of transformation. Today I want to tell you a longer story. It's the story of revivifying the process of doing phishing or social engineering training via celebration. On the other hand, it's also the story of the evolution of a cybersecurity education awareness program itself. I started at St. Luke's Healthcare without a program. As a matter of fact, cybersecurity itself was nascent and just beginning. And then we've gone on the SANS maturity model all the way up to that third pillar. We're getting ready to enter into metrics and analytics. Would that I worked on Nandita's team. So let me begin the story here. The year was 2023, just 15 years before Elon populated the Mars. No, wait, that's the wrong genre. Let's go back another year. It was 2022. I had just completed the 5th season of the Cyber Chronicles. Perhaps we should go back even further to 2018 when the Cyber Chronicles were conceived. The idea was that we would deliver security information, necessary security information, to people who did not necessarily realize that it was essential to their lives, and that we would compete with Netflix to cause them to want to binge consume our content. In order to do that, we leveraged my singular philosophy of cybersecurity education awareness, which is aware, care, prepare. Aware, you must know what time it is. You must realize that we already inhabit a hybrid world between what we used to think of as real and what we used to think of as virtual. Unfortunately, many of us have not adopted the contemporary requisite competencies of a hybrid world. And so we need to bring these things to people's awareness. So we began in the first season with Did You Know? With awareness. We used a film noir approach, trying to emulate the sort of hard-boiled reporter or hard-boiled detective, and we tied every bit of content to narrative. Here's an example of some of the episodes, and we intentionally referred to them as episodes rather than articles. In season 2, we moved from aware to care. If season 1 was Did You Know? Season 2 was Did You Realize? And we tied every episode to something that related to the home environment, leveraging things like references to grandma's cookies and home invasion, hotel stays, things of that nature. We also then added another learning modality. In season 1, we encouraged people to read. In season 2, we recognized that many providers or other clinicians are busy people, and so we added a podcast version of each episode, both from season 1 and season 2, so that they can consume it on their drive to work. If season 1 was aware, season 2 was care, and season 3 is prepare, then obviously we had to give people the opportunity to practice. So we began discussing all of the things that they needed to do, and we attached how-to guides to every one of the episodes. There was a season 4 and a season 5. In season 4, we partnered with the wellness community there at St. Luke's. And also that happened to land right during the middle of COVID. And so utilizing video was very important and necessary at the time. And then what we did was just highlighted that the motivations for cybersecurity education awareness and for health and wellness were the same. There was a really dynamic synergy between myself and the employee who volunteered from the wellness to come and partner with me for season 4. And then in season 5, we did a think like an attacker focus. But I could tell by that time, and it was 2022, we'd begun in 2018, that the energy was beginning to drop. I was no longer getting the same amount of clicks, for example. I was no longer getting as many invitations to come speak as a result of an episode, and decided it was time to retire while we were still in our, at least, aging prime. Along the way, of course, we had been continuing our social engineering training, focusing primarily on phishing. And I maintain in my home network a honeypot network of sorts with a variety of different personas so that I can attract different sorts of phishing emails in the wild and have a good feel for what my various people, there's 17,000 employees at St. Luke's, and they cover the gamut from people who clean the rooms to the CEO to people who do supply chain work and everything in between. There's contractors who work on the building team and CPAs that work with us in finance. And so you're dealing with literally an entire section of people's likes and dislikes, et cetera. So I want to know what they might be likely to see. As a result of what I was seeing, I sent out this phishing email, which to this day seems to me entirely appropriate, except for one little, not so tiny detail. St. Luke's had just recently gone through a very unfortunate public relations scenario where some of our providers and some of our key executives were targeted by representatives of the public very aggressively. There's one of the things that stood out, one of the graphic images that stood out from that time was a photo of our CEO with a target over his face. And so those folks who had been put in under the microscope, if you will, already, some of them were very triggered by this email. Let me give you another look at it. And we were forced as a result, I shouldn't say forced, we decided as a result to actually back out the entire campaign. And this was not a focused one. This was a campaign that had gone out to all 17,000 employees. And so my CISO had to send out this apology email. I will tell you, this was not the highlight of my career. But my CISO shone. She gave me no flack, not any of a hard time. And a couple of very interesting things happened as a result. First of all, out of this was birthed our advisory board that reviews phishing lures before we send them out. We should have, of course, probably already been doing that, but it had not yet happened. And that very quickly came into existence. The second thing was even more interesting. We pulled back all of those emails and we received well over 200 emails in reply from the average person throughout St. Luke's. Well over 85%, actually a little bit over 88% of the replies were similar in nature to this. Go harder, you're just doing your job, we're so thankful for what you're doing, keep it up. That was tremendously encouraging. But it put me in a little bit of a dilemma because on the one hand, we had key influential perspectives within the organization who were now very cautious about what we would send out as a phishing email. But our populace was clamoring for more. In fact, one of the things that's most intriguing to me, we often will send the same lure to the entire organization intentionally because I don't, well, we'll leave that rabbit trail aside. But what's very fascinating about that is the different results you get. One department will write back to you and say, that was the easiest phishing email you've ever sent it. What is the deal? And from the same campaign, a different department with very different expertise will write back and say, what in the world? You got 8 out of 10 of us. It's the hardest phish we've ever seen. Context is tremendously important. And what your particular focus is and your effort as it relates to expertise makes a dramatic difference in how people respond to the same phishing lure. Which means that, and again, this is not what the content of my presentation is about today, but the way that we measure phishing responses needs to evolve. Click rate and reporting rate are excellent and they're good. You'll see more of that from me here momentarily, but we need something that takes into account the complexity of who is responding. So I had a populace asking for more, which is a good place to be, and critical executives who were uncertain how hard we should go. Not only that, but we needed to retire the Cyber Chronicles, and I was worn out. I should have mentioned that I am a team of one, and that remains that way today, and we're well past the time in terms of the maturation cycle where that should have changed. So I was racking my brain about what could I do, and with the few remaining cycles that I had at my disposal, what could I pull off this year? As you can imagine, the Cyber Chronicles had been enormously time intensive in each of the preceding years. I thought about a phishing amnesty because I needed to be able to give people things that would test them like what they were going to see in the real world, but I couldn't threaten them with failure. And you need to understand that when I came into St. Luke's, not only was it a new program for security education and awareness, but we had a punitive policy as it relates to phishing failures. I had been pushing and pushing and pushing for that to change, but it had not yet been approved. I thought about maybe a Phishapalooza, but we ended up going with Phishtoberfest. And my whole idea was that we would celebrate what I did for a living and pull back the curtain and let people see what we were up to and why. And by giving them the freedom to be able to respond without any concerns about the future of their career, they could really embrace and celebrate this as well. So Midjourney and AI was pretty darn new at the time, so I leveraged Midjourney to create images from downtown Boise. St. Luke's is out of Idaho, so that there was familiar landmarks in the photos, and then inserted people doing phishing training throughout downtown Boise. We focused on celebration instead of consequences. I announced ahead of time that we would leverage graduated difficulty, that we would explain what we were doing and why along the way, and the whole intent was to invoke a party and to include everyone. Also, the goal was to have nailed everyone by the end and to get them talking about that experience. Also, along the way, I wanted to really emphasize that I care more about whether they report it than about whether they fail it, because at the end of the day, if you fall for a phishing email, what have you really demonstrated other than that you also participate in the human race? So I wanted to flip the organizational attitude. Along the way, what I did was write an article on our intranet each week, and then here's the initial email I sent out. You can see there the summary of the email. We explained what was going along. You can see that all over the place I said, read first, then report. I really wanted to get people in the habit of leveraging the report phishing button. We had also had issues, as I'm sure many of you had, with Microsoft moving that button around and making it appear or disappear. And it was like a game of whack-a-mole trying to figure out where the button was going to appear this week. So I wanted to really focus people's attention on it and made it impossible for them to fail. Here's what happened as a result of that first salvo. Week 1 had a 51% reporting rate and, of course, 0 failures. Week 2 of October, it was very close to the time when Elon had decided to rename Twitter, and so I figured that X/Twitter was on people's minds. We loaded this with reasons that they should notice that this was not legitimate, whether it be the fact that it's originating in Moscow or the wrong URL in the sending email address, or really even just the why are you getting a Twitter alert in your work email account. We had 85% reporting participation. To put that in perspective, we phish the entire organization, all 17,000 people, once a month, and we phish a certain segment that we refer to as the high accountability personnel, or part of the group. I'm sorry, the 17,000 get phished quarterly, or 4 times per year, once per quarter, and the high accountability personnel get phished on a monthly basis. High accountability personnel is a dynamic and a static group, meaning it's comprised of those teams that ought to always be there, whether that be rev cycle or supply chain, the executive team, for example, but also those who have recently been targeted by spear phishing or attempted account takeover. They'll find themselves in the HAP group for 90 days as well. My point is that the highest reporting rate we've ever seen at St. Luke's over the previous 6 years was 87%, and that came from the high accountability personnel group, who, as you can imagine, overall do much better both in terms of not failing and in reporting than do the people who are only phished once per quarter. So 85% reporting rate, 1% failure, which is not bad. On average, we see 1 to 1.8% failure rate from the entire org and 0 to 0.7% failure rate from the high accountability personnel group. So week 3, I decided to make it a little bit more difficult. You, of course, shouldn't be getting Twitter alerts on your work email. But of course, the longer that you've worked at an organization, the more difficult it becomes to separate your personal and your professional life. If you've been someplace, we had someone recently retire after 36 years. At that point, is there really any difference between your work email and your personal email? Often not. But there's much more legitimate reason to expect to be able to see something from LinkedIn in your work inbox. And so we went out and found a real profile. This is a real Jason Riley. He does not work for St. Luke's, but he is in HR. He has a different colored background than this profile photo, but if anyone decided to double check and go the extra mile, they would see him as a real individual. There are several other giveaways that they could have noticed. Overall, it was more difficult, but certainly not impossible or too difficult to be able to recognize. We had a 74% reporting rate and, as expected, a 3% failure rate. So we're seeing what we would expect and happy with the results as of yet. What I should also say is that what this was invoking was dramatic and remarkable. I spend a considerable amount of my time going to, whether it's a staff stand-up meeting on a Med-Surg 5 for 3 minutes, or 45 minutes with a team during their monthly staff meeting. I spend a good amount of my time doing personal presentations on a variety of subjects. The clinical educators, for example, had even had me come back month after month in a series of 4 different visits. And we were able to go from 101 to 301 by the time we were done. I've been blessed at St. Luke's with not only remarkable political support all the way from the top to really thorough support around the organization. But that went through the roof. I was spending 3 to 4 days a week giving presentations around the organization as people began the process of talking about and celebrating phishing, knowing that it was going to be more difficult. For week 4, we decided to leverage people's weak spot. St. Luke's is a Microsoft Office 365 shop. And I told you the numbers that we can expect on average. They're very low in terms of failure. But anytime I decide to send out a Microsoft Office 365 lure, our numbers of failures go up dramatically. I've seen as high as 20% for a email that was a perfect imitation almost of a Microsoft. And the problem, of course, is that it's coming externally. Looks like it's an external email, and yet we treat it as if it's internal, and we see a lot of these in DocuSign often trip people up if you happen to use DocuSign in your environment. So we'd had historically horrible results. This is very, very little giveaways in that email. I'm not sure how well you can see the details on screen. This does have a misspelled Microsoft. It's Microsoft. Other than that, there's not really much to give this away. But what we saw was very interesting. Our failures rose to 8%. That was expected. I actually thought it might even be higher. I will say we had a large number of non-response to this 4th campaign. But our reporting dropped from, 81 to 74, all the way to 38%. And I think I had exhausted people's willingness to continue being involved. Those who were excited about it had already asked me to come speak to them, or whatever else, other actions they had taken. The other factor that I think is involved is that if people catch it, they're very willing to report it. If they get caught by it, they're not quite so willing to report the email. And so I think that affected this as well. I don't know for sure, and I've spent a lot of time talking to people since then, trying to get a feel for what impacted the dramatic drop in reporting. But I will say that 4 weeks is a long time to sustain a celebratory attitude, and I think that impacted it as well. The other, just really quickly, let's take a look at these in aggregate. So you had 51% reporting when nobody could fail, and it went to everyone. Clearly, they read at the very least the intro to the subject line to the email. We went up from there to 85%, which was stellar. We saw 74%, which is still excellent, and I'm very happy with that. On average, we are between 55 to 68% reporting rate over the course of years. So 74 is still very good. And then this dramatic drop to 38% surprised the heck out of me. Along the way, here's some of my reflections. These are the other articles that went along with each week's email. I'm explaining in depth what I'm doing and why, how we approach this, what we want to benefit them to benefit from it, and how. I will say that the best thing that came out of this was we earned an enduring positive attitude even from those cautious execs. And I was able to get in a revised phishing standard approved as a result of Phishtoberfest, so that now there is no punitive response to failing. And there's a real emphasis on the process of reporting. In every single lecture that I do around the healthcare system, I emphasize the way that phishing works if it's not spear phishing. The idea that it comes in waves of between 300 to 3,000 emails on average, and that if you happen to be recipient number 12, and you condemn the email, which happens to be one of the less than 2% of all malicious email traffic that comes into St. Luke's, the other more than 98% is blocked or dropped. If you happen to be a recipient, you report that, then we can stop the remaining 1,700 or whatever there might be, dramatically improving our odds, since all we need is one to click on the potentially ransomware email, right? You may be recipient number 2,999, but you don't know, so please report this email, even if you've already fallen for it. And that is very well received throughout the organization. I will say that we had too much success. I didn't even get the 4th article done and out because, as I said, I was spending 3 or 4 days a week giving multiple presentations a day and responding to all of the feedback that this generated. It was overwhelming. I didn't get a chance to look up the number of emails I received in the first week, but it was significant. I was up until the wee hours of the night responding. But we failed to capitalize on the momentum that this generated for us, except in the change that we were able to bring about relative to the phishing standard. Had I had a team in place, had I had a plan, this was done as a last-ditch, maybe this will work effort. It was not a 6-month planning effort where I said, how could we leverage this? And no, it was more like, I wonder if this would work. And it worked spectacularly. But I would say that this might correlate, and I don't have the data. Perhaps Federico and I should be talking, but I don't have the data to be able to say what the correlation is between where you're at on the SANS maturity model and how many employees or FTEs you ought to be leveraging at each bar. But I'm sure there is some sort of correlation, and we have certainly hit it. At this point, I do have access to a couple of interns, and they have proven very, very helpful. Although, of course, that can be, one intern is not the same as another, and you have them for a short period of time, and the next one could be amazing, and the next one might not be so impressive. So that's a little bit unreliable. Anyway, that really is what I wanted to tell you about. In one sense, it's a confession. I'm airing my dirty laundry. On the other hand, there was a lot of wins along the way. And I will say that I created a good problem, which is that I successfully identified cybersecurity at St. Luke's with my face. And so I get a large number of contacts that should be tickets or for this team or for that team. But again, that's a good problem to have, and it sets us up for the next stage of evolution. Are there any questions I could answer in response to anything I've presented today?
Are we good? Hey. Okay, if y'all have questions in the audience, please raise your hand. But one question that I personally had for you, Nathan, I think your third bullet point up there, it's not the first time we've heard that at this conference. You generated all this buzz, people were talking, people wanted you to come speak to them, and then it just stops. So in hindsight, knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently to capitalize on that momentum?
I would have had my champions. We do have an ambassador program that is very active, and I should have had some of them teed up in order to handle the response that I got and be able to do a lot of that presenting work around the organization. The other reason that would be pivotal for us is that because I am not very often going to be able to reach RN Jenny on 3rd shift at a rural hospital. And so if you can get those ambassadors on her team, for example, that is enormously helpful. But that would have been the thing. Had I teed them up to be able to present, given them some material to present to, that could have gone really, really well as given me a lot more specific feedback than what I was able to collect just directly coming back to me.
Absolutely, especially as like a one-man show, right? Leveraging those connections that you have to really push past that steam is really important.
For
Do
sure.
we have any questions in the audience? Raise your hand. No? Okay, I have another one online. From Angel, she asks, what is included in the phishing standard?
Well, basically, we just describe what we expect, who will be phished when, and then what the tiers of response will be. Um, I actually want to revise that again in order to shift to where the response is participation in Clickers Anonymous, which would be an invite meeting for everyone who failed, and then they just get to come together and really dialogue with one another about their experience. When that is moderated, you're able to turn something that could otherwise be negative, once again, into something celebratory, and it's really remarkable the impact that has. The very first person who failed at St. Luke's and I had to go visit was someone that reminded me very much of my mother. And so I, in a similar age, and so I showed up with tea, and you could visibly see her visage change when I said, hey, let's sit down, let's have some tea, and let's chat. I did not have quite so much sympathy for the IT person who keeps exposing their internet, their password in the all St. Luke's chat on Teams. But that's a whole nother story.
Awesome.
It has to do with John Wayne, by the way.
Let's give another round of applause for Nate then.